"Step back from the property, sir." That was the first sentence I understood after the anesthesia lifted, and it was not spoken to me by a nurse. It was spoken by a man in a reflective vest, standing between me and my own driveway at 11,004 in the morning, one eye of mine still taped, a plastic hospital wristband on my left wrist, and behind him, 2 orange dumpsters where my wife's carriage house studio used to stand. "Sir." "Back up," I said. "That's my house." He said, "It's an active condemnation site. You want to argue. You argue with the Marshal." I asked which Marshal. He looked at the clipboard. He said, "Vogel." I had trained Dennis Vogel in 1998. I had signed his lieutenant's card. I had eaten dinner at his mother's table 3 days after his father died. And on the front door of my house, taped at eye level, was an emergency order with his signature at the bottom. I did not sit down. I did not cry. I walked past the vest, past the dumpsters, past the shattered kiln lying on its side in the gravel like a dog someone had shot, and I read the order twice. Then I turned around, looked at the taillights of the last truck leaving my drive, and I understood that whatever had just happened to me had been scheduled. Down to the minute, I would still be under. Take me back 3 hours. 3 hours earlier, a nurse had taken my glasses and dropped them into a plastic bag with my wallet and the front door key. She wrote Kendrick, Bruce on the wristband and asked who was picking me up. I said my daughter. She said, "And your daughter's name, sir?" I said, "Jessica Ashford." She wrote it, and the pen made a small ticking sound against the clipboard I would remember later. My cataract was in the left eye. The procedure was 40 minutes. Recovery was 90. Discharge at 10:40. Simple. I had chosen a Wednesday because Jessica had said Wednesdays were quiet at her husband Scott's office and she could drive me. I had chosen this month because the surgeon had an opening. I had told exactly 4 people the date: Jessica, Scott, the surgeon, and Dennis Vogel. Dennis, because 2 Sundays before, on the porch after his son's christening, he had asked me what I was doing that week, and I had told him honestly. He said, "You need a ride?" I said, "Jess has it." He said, "Good man." And then he asked me casually if the kiln in Helen's studio was still hooked up to gas. I told him yes. He nodded once and did not ask anything else. I did not think about that nod again until I stood on my own gravel with tape on my eye and read his name on the order that had emptied my life. Helen died 6 years and 4 months before that Wednesday. She did not die in the studio. She died in a hospital bed 2 towns over on a Tuesday afternoon while I was signing a form. But the studio was where she had lived. 41 years of leaded glass. A soldering iron with a cracked Bakelite handle wound in copper wire. She rewound it herself the winter our daughter turned 9 because she said a new one felt like a stranger in her hand. Chemical jars along the sill in the order she used them. 4 unfinished panels for a chapel window, cut but not soldered, laid out on the workbench under a piece of muslin. And the kiln. The kiln she had cooled on a Sunday and never fired again. I did not touch any of it after she died. I swept the floor. I paid the electric, so the small heater would keep the glue from freezing. I stood in the doorway some evenings. That was the room. That was the room that on the morning of my surgery was loaded into 2 dumpsters by a 4-man crew and driven to a transfer station out of county before I woke up. And the man who signed the paper that allowed them to do it had held my elbow at Helen's graveside and told me he owed me his career. Now walk with me back to 7001T that morning. At 7012 a.m., while I was on a gurney being asked to count backward from 10, a black F-350 backed a roll-off dumpster into my gravel drive. The neighbor across the road, a retired schoolteacher named Ruth, would tell me this at 12,030, that same afternoon, standing on her porch in a housecoat with her arms crossed so tight her knuckles were white. "I thought it was a delivery," she said. Then the second one came. Then the men. She said the men wore navy shirts with a logo she did not recognize, and one of them taped a paper to my front door with clear packing tape, 3 strips, careful, like he had done it before. She said a white sedan pulled up at 7031, and a man in a fire department jacket got out, looked at the paper, nodded to the crew, took a photograph on his phone, and drove away. She said she did not see the crew again after 9001 feet. By then, Helen's studio was on a truck. Ruth said, "Bruce, I called Jessica. I had her number from the church directory. She didn't pick up. I left a message. I asked what time. Ruth said, 7:40, maybe 7:42. Jessica was supposed to pick me up at 10:30. Her phone had been on. I know because at 8004 that morning, on the same phone, she texted her husband a single word. I would see the word before the day ended. It was not a word, a confused person. Types. But I did not know about that text yet. At 11:04, I stood in my drive with my keys in a plastic bag and my daughter nowhere. I called her. It went to voicemail. I called Scott. It went to voicemail. I called the non-emergency dispatch and asked for the fire marshal on duty. The woman who answered had been in the department 19 years and knew my voice. She said, "Chief, are you okay?" I said, "Sherry, who signed a condemnation on my house this morning." There was silence. Then she said, "Sir, I'm looking. I have it here. It's Marshal Vogel." I said, "On what grounds?" She said, "Emergency chemical hazard, kiln venting, lead compounds. It was called in yesterday at 4:22 p.m. I said, "Called in by who?" She hesitated. She said, "Sir, I can't give you that on the phone, but you can request the intake in person." I said, "Sherry, I trained him." She said very quietly, "I know, Chief." I hung up. I stood in the gravel. The taped paper on my door lifted once in the wind and settled. And then a car I did not know pulled up to the curb, a small silver hatchback. And a woman I had never seen got out with a manila envelope in her hand and asked me if I was Bruce Kendrick. She was in her early 40s, hair pulled back, no jewelry. She said, "My name is Marion. I live 3 blocks north on the same corridor. My husband died in April. 2 weeks ago they condemned my garage. I saw the trucks here this morning on my way to work. I turned around." She held out the envelope. She said, "I don't know you, but you need to read what's inside before anyone tells you what happened here today." I took it. My hand shook, and I hated that it shook, so I steadied it against my thigh. I said, "What is this?" She said, "It's every notice they gave me, every signature, every LLC name on the buyer's side. I've been walking around with it in the trunk of my car for a week, trying to figure out who to hand it to." She looked at the taped order on my door. She said, "I think I just did." She got back in the hatchback. She left the envelope. She said through the window, "There are 4 of us, 3 widows, and now you." She drove away before I could ask her name a second time. I stood on my own gravel with an envelope from a stranger, an eye taped shut, and the smell of scorched kiln brick in the air. Then a black SUV came fast down the road, brakes hard, and my daughter Jessica got out crying. She ran to me. She grabbed my forearms. She said, Dad, I just got the messages. I was in a closing. My phone was in the car." She was crying real tears. I have known this woman 38 years, and I know her real tears. She said, "Scott told me it was a mold remediation. He said the insurance flagged it. He said they'd have it back together before you got home. I swear to God, Dad, I swear." I said, "Jess, look at the drive." She looked. She said, "Oh my God." I said, "Look at the door." She looked. She read the paper. She said, "Dennis?" She said his first name like a question mark. I said, "Dennis." She said, "Dennis was at Emma's christening." I said, "I know." She said, "Dennis carried Emma to the font." I said, "I know." Then she saw the manila envelope in my hand and she said, "What's that?" I said, "A woman I don't know just gave it to me. She said she lives on our corridor. She said there are 4 of us." Jessica went very still. Her mouth moved once without sound. Then she said, "Dad, Can I look inside? I said, in a minute. I said, first tell me what the word on your phone said. She said, what word? I said, the one you sent Scott at 8:04. Her face changed. She said, Dad, how do you? I said, Ruth saw the trucks and called you at 7:40. I checked my phone log while you were driving up. There's a missed call from Ruth at 7:41. Your text to Scott went out at 8:04. I know because you were on our family plan until March, and the log still comes to my email. I just haven't cleaned it out. Her eyes filled again. She said, it was one word. It said, today? I said, today? She said, today, with a question mark. Because he had told me it was next Wednesday, Dad. He told me the mold thing was next Wednesday. I hadn't scheduled anyone for it. I hadn't warned you. When Ruth called and said dumpsters, I thought maybe he'd bumped it up and forgotten to tell me. That's what the word meant, I promise you. I looked at her. I have interviewed liars in 3 fires and 2 arsons. She was not one. I said, Jess, if it was mold, it doesn't get hauled to a transfer station out of county. It gets bagged on site. She said, I know that now. I said, you should have known it at 8:05. She sat down on my porch step, and she put her head in her hands, and she cried in a way I had not heard from her since her mother's funeral. I said, open the envelope. She opened it. She read the top page, then the second, then the third. On the 4th, she stopped and looked up and said, Dad. I said, what? She said, the buyer LLC on my garage, the one Scott handled for me. It's the same LLC on this woman's condemnation. I said, which woman? She said, Marion Delgado. 3 blocks north. April. It says, Ashford Holdings, Series C. I said, whose name is on Series C? She turned the page. Her hand stopped. She said, Scott. And a cosigner. I said, read the cosigner. She said, Dennis Vogel. She said it flat, the way people say the name of a stranger. Then she said it again, softer, the way people say the name of a friend they have just recognized on a police scanner. She said, Dad, Dennis is his godfather. I forgot. I actually forgot. When Scott and I started dating, I asked him who the older man at Thanksgiving was, and Scott said, my godfather's, and I didn't put it together with the fire marshal because Dennis at Thanksgiving is just Dennis. I said, Jess. She said, Dad, I signed on the garage. I said, I know. She said, I signed on 2 other things. I said, I know. She said, what do I do? I said, give me 20 minutes. She said, for what? I said, to find my class. A jacket. I need to check if it still fits. I had not opened that closet since Helen's memorial. The jacket hung inside a garment bag, with the zipper still on the paper receipt from the dry cleaner. Class A, navy wool, Chief's brass on the collar, 34 years of pins on the left breast. I laid it on the bed. I laid the trousers next to it. The shirt was in a drawer, still folded the way Helen used to fold my shirts, because after she died I had not owned a shirt worth folding that way, and I had not disturbed the drawer. I sat on the edge of the bed, with one eye still taped, and I looked at the jacket for a long time. Jessica knocked on the doorframe. She said, Dad, there's a benefit tonight. I said, I know there's a benefit tonight. She said, they're honoring him. I said, I know they're honoring him. She said, Dad, if you go in that uniform to that room. I said, then people will look. She said, Dennis will look. I said, yes. She said, Scott will look. I said, yes. She said, Dad, if you do this, there is no walking it back. I said, Jess. He drove past my driveway at 7:31 this morning and photographed the paper on my door. There was nothing to walk back to. She was quiet. Then she said, what do you need? I said, a ride. And Marion's phone number. Marion picked up on the second ring. I said, "It's Bruce Kendrick." She said, "I hoped it would be." I said, "How many of us?" She said, "4 on our corridor that I can prove. 2 more, I suspect. All widowed, all over 60, all without buildings. A garage, a barn, a studio, a screened porch converted to a shop." I said, "All condemned by Vogel." She said, "Everyone." I said, "All bought by an Ashford LLC." She said, 2 by Series B, 2 by Series C. My husband's death certificate is stapled to the intake on mine. Somebody pulled it from the county. I said, "Marion, why come to me?" She was quiet. Then she said, "Because my husband was a paramedic. He worked 11 years under you. He said once, at a Christmas thing, that if anything ever went really wrong, I should find the old chief. I couldn't remember your name for 2 weeks. I finally called the department yesterday and asked for the retirement roster, and yours was the address they gave for a plaque delivery last year, and I recognized the street." I said, "What was your husband's name?" She said, "Ray Delgado." I said, "Ray drove engine 6. She said, "Yes." I said, "Marion, I'm going to a benefit tonight. Would you be willing to sit in the back of the room with the folder on your lap?" She said, "I already have the folder in my hand." Jessica sat at my kitchen table with her laptop. She said, "Dad, if you're going to do this in a public room, you need a person in the room who is not you and not me." I said, "I know." She said, "The state fire marshal is speaking tonight. His office is on the program. He presents the plaque." I said, "I know." She said, "I have his community liaison cell. It's in Scott's contacts because Scott bid on their office renovation last year, and I made the call to schedule the walkthrough. I have it on my phone." I looked at her. I said, "Jess, if I call that number from your phone, your name is on the log." She said, "I know." She said, "Call it from mine." I said, "Are you sure?" She said, "Dad, I signed things I should not have signed. I'm not asking you to protect me from what I did. I'm asking you to let me be the one who dialed." I said, "That's not a small thing." She said, "Neither is what he did to Mom's room." She said, "Mom's room, not the studio." And I remembered that Helen had taught Jessica to solder a butterfly wing on her 10th birthday, and Jessica had cried because a piece of glass sliced her thumb, and Helen had said, "Baby, that's the price of a wing." Jessica had kept the butterfly on her dresser through college. I did not know if she still had it. I did not ask. I said, "Dial." She dialed. She put it on speaker. A woman answered and said her name. Jessica said, "This is Jessica Ashford. My father is Chief Bruce Kendrick, retired battalion chief, 34 years of service. He needs 3 minutes with the state fire marshal tonight at the memorial benefit, in person, before the plaque is presented to District Marshal Vogel. It is a matter concerning district conduct on 4 residential properties inside the North Corridor rezoning envelope." The woman on the other end did not speak for 4 seconds. Then she said, "Ma'am, that is not a phone call I usually take on this line." Jessica said, "I know." The woman said, "Is your father willing to bring documentation?" I leaned toward the phone. I said, "I am willing to bring documentation. Copies. In a sealed folder. I will hand it to whoever the state marshal designates. I will not stage a scene at the podium. I will approach him during the reception before the ceremony begins. I will wear my uniform. I will identify myself." There was another pause. The woman said, "Chief, my father was a firefighter." I said, "Where?" She said, 2 states east. He died on the job in '96. I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "The marshal will meet you at the coat check at 6:40. Bring 1 folder. Bring nothing else. Do not speak to Marshal Vogel before 6:40. I said, "I won't." She said, "Chief, wear the jacket." She hung up. Jessica put both hands flat on the table. She said, "Dad, it's 4:02. We left the house at 5:50. Jessica drove. I sat in the passenger seat with the folder on my lap and the wristband still on my wrist because I had not yet had a moment to cut it off, and it seemed suddenly important to arrive still wearing it. The jacket fit. The trousers were loose in the waist by an inch, and I did not care. In the rear view, I could see the taped paper still on my front door, small and white, and behind it, the empty square of gravel where the studio had been. Jessica said, "Dad, do you want me to come inside?" I said, "Not to the coat check. After." She said, "Scott will be there." I said, "I know." She said, "Scott is presenting the Community Partner Award." I turned my head. I said, "Say that again." She said, "Ashford Holdings is the community partner this year. Scott's giving a 2-minute speech. I helped him rehearse it Sunday. He talked about redevelopment as an act of neighborhood love." She said, "Neighborhood love the way you say the name of a food that has just made you sick." I looked out the windshield. The road to the hall passed the north corridor. From the passenger side, I could see the boarded windows of a small yellow house I had never noticed before, a real estate sign at the curb, and behind it, in the side yard, a bare square of dirt where an outbuilding used to stand. It was the 5th one. Ours was the 6th. We pulled up at 6:32. The valet took the keys. Jessica squeezed my hand once and did not speak. I walked in alone. The hall was full of dress uniforms and the low, warm noise of people who have known each other 20 years. I kept my head down and moved along the wall to the coat check. A woman in a black blazer was standing next to it with an earpiece and a clipboard. She saw the folder, then the collar brass, then my face. She said, "Chief Kendrick." I said, "Yes." She said, "This way." She walked me around a curtain into a small service corridor that smelled like coffee and warm linen. A tall gray-haired man in a navy jacket with silver piping was waiting. He offered his hand. He said, "Chief, I'm sorry we're meeting like this." I gave him the folder. I said, "Sir, 4 condemnations on 1 corridor in 11 months. Same signature, same buyer chain, same co-signer. 3 widows and 1 widower. The widower is me. My protege signed the paper this morning while I was under general anesthesia for cataract surgery." He opened the folder. He read for 90 seconds without moving. Then he closed it and said, "Chief, stay in this hallway. Do not go back to the floor. I need to make 1 call. You will hear me call it. You will not speak. Is that acceptable?" I said, "Yes, sir." He turned. He lifted his phone. And then, behind me, a door opened, and Dennis Vogel walked into the corridor. He was in his own class. A. His plaque was already pinned to a small easel on the wall behind him. He saw me. He saw the state marshal. He saw the folder in the state marshal's hand. For 1 full second, his face was the face of a lieutenant in 1998, caught with the wrong hose coupling in a training bay. Young, exposed, all the smoothness gone. Then it closed. He said, "Chief, what are you doing back here?" I did not answer. The state marshal did not answer. Dennis said, "Bruce, whatever this is, we can talk about this. Not tonight. Not here." I looked at the wristband on my wrist. I looked at the brass on his collar that I had put there. I said, "Dennis, where is the kiln?" He said, "What?" I said, "The kiln. Helen's kiln. Where did the truck take it?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. He said, "Bruce, that was a hazard call. That was a legitimate hazard call." I said, "Where is the kiln?" The state marshal put a hand very lightly on my elbow. He said, "Chief, not yet." Then to Dennis, evenly, "Marshal Vogel, please stay in this corridor. I have a call to place. And after that call, you and I will step into the manager's office for a conversation that will not be brief." Dennis did not move. Behind him, past the curtain, I heard a microphone tap twice and a voice welcome the room to the annual benefit, and I understood we had not yet begun. Dennis Vogel stood in the doorway of the reception hall wearing his dress blues, the same class, a cut as mine, only cleaner. He had not seen me yet. He was laughing at something a young captain had said. His head tilted the way he used to tilt it in the truck bay in 1998 when he was still trying to prove he belonged. I let him laugh. I let the captain slap his shoulder and move on. Then I stepped into his line of sight, and I watched the laugh drain from his face the way water drains from a bad seal. He said, "Chief." I said, "Marshal." He said, "I did not know you were on the list." I said, "I put myself on it." He looked at the taped patch over my left eye. He looked at the manila envelope under my right arm. He said, "Bruce, whatever you think this is." I said, "I think it is what it is." Behind him, through the open doors, the room was already filling. Round tables, white linens, the small brass placard on the head table that read, "District Fire Marshal Dennis Vogel, Distinguished Service." He tried to smile. It did not reach the corners. He said, "Let's talk outside." I said, "No. Let's talk in there." I walked past him. He did not follow at first. The hall smelled the way these halls always smell. Coffee kept warm too long, floor wax, the faint chlorine of a hotel that shares a wall with the pool. I knew half the men in that room. I had put bunker gear on half of them. A retired captain named Bill lifted a hand at me from the third table and then let it drop when he saw my face. A woman I had not seen in 4 years mouthed the words, "Are you okay?" I did not answer her. I looked for the head table. I looked for the man I had come to find. The state fire marshal was already seated. Gray crew-cut class. A jacket, the small silver bugles on his collar. Beside him, a woman in a navy suit was pouring water for herself from a glass pitcher, and her name badge said, "Community Liaison, Office of the District Attorney." Sherry. That was the name Marion had given me over the kitchen phone. Sherry Delaney. I did not approach yet. I stood at the back wall with the envelope pressed flat against my thigh, and I waited for the invocation to end, because you do not interrupt a chaplain in a firehouse, and I was still, after everything, a fireman. The chaplain was 91 and had buried more of us than I could count. He said the names of the 4 brothers we had lost that year, and I lowered my head because you lower your head. And I felt Vogel come up behind me and stand at my shoulder, the way a man stands next to a bomb he is hoping will not go off. He whispered, "Bruce, please. Not here. Not tonight. My daughter is at that table." I did not look at him. I said, "Helen was at that workbench." He said, "It was a code call, a ventilation deficiency. There is a paper trail. There is a—" I said, "Dennis, there is a paper trail because you made one." The chaplain said amen. The room said amen. The chairs scraped as people sat. Vogel did not sit. He stood beside me with his hands folded behind him, parade rest, the way I had taught him when he was 26 years old and could not stop fidgeting during roll call. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want you to walk with me to that table." He said, "Bruce." I said, "Or I walk alone. Either way, I get there." I felt him weigh it. I felt him lose. I walked. He did not. I crossed the carpet between the tables and I felt the room begin to notice the small ripples of talk that die at the edge of your passing. I reached the head table and I stopped at Sherry Delaney's chair. She looked up. I said, "Ma'am, my name is Bruce Kendrick. I retired from this department 6 years ago as a battalion chief. I have paperwork I need to hand you and the marshal at the same time." She set the pitcher down. She did not fluster. She said, "Chief, is this something that can wait until Monday morning at my office?" I said, "One of the 4 widows on that paperwork buried her husband in April. The paperwork is dated the same week." I saw her face change 1 degree. She said, "Sit down, please." I did not sit. I laid the envelope between her plate and the state marshal's plate. The state marshal, his name was Halvorsen, and he had spoken at my retirement, turned his head slowly toward me and said, "Bruce." I said, "Marshal Halvorsen, open it. Before the presentation, please." His eyes went to Delaney. Hers went to the envelope. She reached out. She opened the clasp. She slid the pages out onto the linen. She read the top page. The condemnation on my property, dated the 22nd, signed at the bottom by Dennis Vogel. She turned to the second page. Another condemnation. Another widowed household 2 blocks north, signed by Vogel on the 9th of the same month. The third page. A widow named Ruth Halvorsen on the corner lot, signed by Vogel in February. The fourth page. The assemblage summary I'd pulled from the county assessor at 4 that afternoon. Every one of the 4 condemned parcels now held under an LLC, whose managing member was Scott Ashford, my son-in-law. The last sheet in the envelope was the loan doc, $2.4 million from a regional lender, co-signed by Dennis Vogel as personal guarantor 3 months earlier. Halvorsen read it. His jaw worked once. He said quietly, "This is his signature on the loan." I said, "Yes, sir." Delaney said, without looking up, "Chief, may I keep these tonight?" I said, "I have copies at my kitchen table. That set is yours." Halvorsen said, "Where is Marshal Vogel?" I turned. Vogel was already walking toward the head table, his color gone, one hand raised in the small pacifying gesture I had seen him use with civilians for 28 years. The MC at the podium, a young public information officer I did not know, was already unfolding his cards. He tapped the mic. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, if we could take our seats." Halvorsen stood. Halvorsen said, into the wireless clip to his lapel, "Hold the program. 2 minutes." The room went still, the way a room goes still when a man with silver on his collar tells it to. Vogel reached the table. Halvorsen did not offer him a chair. Halvorsen said, "Dennis, walk with me." Vogel said, "Marshal, I can explain the condemnations." "There is a legitimate," Halvorsen said. "You are going to walk with me to that side room, and you are going to sit down." He turned to me. He said, "Chief Kendrick, I would like you to come as well." Delaney stood. She lifted the pages carefully by the corners. She said, "Chief, I would like you present when I take his statement." I said, "Yes, ma'am." Behind me, at the third table, Bill, the retired captain, stood up. He did not know what he had just seen. He knew enough to stand. 2 other men at his table stood with him. Then a woman at the next table. Then, in a small ripple I would not have believed, most of the room. The side room was a coat closet the hotel had cleared out for staff briefings, 6 feet by 10, 1 folding table, 3 chairs. Halvorsen took 1. Delaney took 1. Vogel took the third and sat down heavier than he meant to. I stood at the door because there were only 3 chairs and because I wanted him to have to look up to answer. Halvorsen said, "Dennis, when did you first inspect the Kendrick property?" Vogel said, "Marshal, my daughter is in that hall. She is 14. "She is going to hear about," Halvorsen said. "When did you first inspect it?" Vogel said, "I did not personally inspect it. The order was issued on the basis of a written complaint and a site report submitted by an outside consultant." Halvorsen said, "The consultant's name?" Vogel did not answer. Delaney flipped to a page. She said, "The consultant is a firm called Ash Corp Compliance. Its listed principal is Scott Ashford, your co-signee on the loan document." Vogel said nothing. Halvorsen said, "Dennis." Vogel said quietly, looking at his hands, "Scott is my godson. His father was my closest friend in the academy. He died in '89. I raised that boy for 2 years after his mother." Delaney's pen stopped. She looked up. She said, "You are Scott Ashford's godfather." I heard the word, and I felt something inside me lock into place with the small, clean sound a deadbolt makes when the door is finally shut. Godfather. I had known Vogel 28 years, and I had never heard him say the boy's name. Not once. Not at retirements, not at Christmas parties, not the night his own wife left him, and he sat in my truck for 2 hours without speaking. He had kept it partitioned. I understood, in that closet, that the partition was the whole point. He said, still to his hands, "Chief, Bruce, I want you to know I did not touch the studio." I said, "You signed the order." He said, "I signed a code compliance order based on a filing. I did not know the crew was coming that morning. I did not know it was Helen's studio. I have not been in your house since her funeral." I said, "Dennis, you wrote her name on the second page. Property owner of record, Helen M. Kendrick, deceased." He looked up at me for the first time. His eyes were wet in the corners, and I did not care. Halvorsen said, "Chief, step out with me 1 minute." I stepped out. Halvorsen shut the closet door behind us and put his hand on my forearm and said one word. "Enough?" I said. "Not yet." I stood in the hotel hallway and I dialed the number Marion had written under Halvorsen on the yellow legal pad on my kitchen table. It was 9:40 at night. A woman answered on the second ring, sharp and awake. I said, "Mrs. Halvorsen, my name is Bruce Kendrick. I am a retired battalion chief. Your name is on a piece of paper I just handed to the state fire marshal." There was a long pause. She said, "The one that took my husband's shop." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "It has been 11 months. Nobody has called me." I said, "Somebody is calling you now." She said, "Are you the man they said would come?" I said, "I do not know who these are, but if somebody said somebody would come, I am here." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "My son-in-law bought the lot in July through a company. My daughter thought it was a rescue purchase because we could not pay the fine. I signed. I signed everything. I did not read." I said, "Ma'am, are you sitting down?" She said, "I am always sitting down now." I said, "The company that bought your lot. Do you have any paper with the name on it?" She said, "I have all of it. Nobody ever asks." I went back into the side room. Halvorsen and Delaney were still with Vogel. He had not moved. I said, "Marshal, Ms. Delaney, there is a fourth widow. She is at home tonight, and she has documentation." Delaney said, "How far?" I said, 22 minutes if the interstate is clear." She said, "I will send a car in the morning." I said, "Ma'am, with respect. She has been 11 months alone with that paperwork. She will let one of us in tonight." Delaney looked at Halvorsen. Halvorsen looked at me. He said, "Chief, go, take Sherry. I will hold the room here." Vogel looked up. He said, "Bruce." I did not look at him. I did not look at him again for a long time. Delaney took her coat off the hook by the door. She said, on the way out, "Chief, one question. Why tonight? Why not Monday, at my office, cleanly?" I said, "Because Monday he was going to be honored. And after a man is honored, it is harder to make people look at what he did. That is not law. That is just how a firehouse works." She thought about it. She said, "I am not sure I disagree with you." We walked out through the hall. The room was still standing. Sherry Delaney drove. I sat in the passenger seat with the envelope on my lap and one eye still taped, and I did not speak for the first 6 miles. She said, finally, "Chief, how long were you a chief?" I said, 22 years an officer. 6 as battalion. She said, "Vogel was under you the whole time." I said, "From 98 until I put in my papers. He was my lieutenant, then my captain. I wrote the letter that got him Marshal." She said, "That is what I was afraid of." I said, "So am I." She said, "You understand this is going to look, to some people, like you settling a personal score against a man who came up under you." I said, "I understand." She said, "It is not though, is it?" I said, "No, ma'am. It is a personal score against a man who used what I taught him to condemn my dead wife's room." "That is different." She was quiet a mile. She said, "Yes, that is different." We pulled off the interstate. The Halvorsen address was a bungalow on a corner lot with a bare foundation slab where the husband's shop used to stand. Ruth Halvorsen was on the porch in a bathrobe with a box at her feet. She had been waiting. Ruth was 74. She had white hair cut short and a hearing aid in her left ear and hands that shook a little when she picked up the top folder. She said, "I want to say his name first. My husband, Henry Halvorsen. He was a machinist. That shop out back was his for 46 years, Sherry said. Yes, ma'am." Ruth opened the folder. She laid papers out on the kitchen table one by one. The condemnation, signed by Vogel. The demolition invoice, addressed to a compliance firm out of the same suite as Scott's Holding, LLC. A purchase offer for the empty lot, $41,000, from an entity called Ash Corp Corridor Holdings. Then, at the bottom of the stack, a Christmas card. She said, "This came in December. From the man who bought the lot. It says, 'Thank you for making this easier on your family.'" She turned it toward me. Under the typed line, in a hand I knew, Scott had signed my grandson's kindergarten forms in the same slant, was the letter S. Just as Sherry took a photograph of it. Then another. Ruth said, "Chief, my daughter still thinks she saved me. She still thinks she saved me. Do you understand what I am telling you?" I said, "Yes, ma'am. My daughter thinks the same thing tonight." Sherry laid the 4 purchase prices out on Ruth's table with her finger. Halvorsen, $41,000. The Widow on Elm, $38. The Widow on Grove, $44. Mine. On the offer that had arrived at the county assessor 3 days after the condemnation and that I had not yet been shown, $46,000 for a corner lot appraised at $290. She said, "Chief, your parcel closes out an assemblage that a mid-market developer has been paying $85 a square for 2 miles south. The reconciled value of the 4 corners together, entitled for mixed use, is a hair over $11 million. I set my hand flat on the table because I could feel the tremor beginning in the fingers. $11 million. Vogel's guarantee on the loan was $2.4. My daughter's husband was not a mid-sized contractor turning small profits. He was the assembler of a corridor whose value, on the day the last widow signed, more than quadrupled overnight. Ruth said, "Is that a lot of money?" Sherry said gently, "Yes, ma'am." "It is," Ruth said. "Then why did he come to my porch himself the day the machines came and tell me he was sorry and cry?" I did not have an answer. Sherry wrote the number 11 in her notebook and underlined it twice. My phone rang at 11:02. I was still at Ruth's table. It was Jessica. I stepped onto the porch. She said, "Dad." Her voice was flat. She said, "Scott is not home. He has not come home. He took the truck at 8:30 and he has not answered his phone." I said, "Where is Emma?" She said, "Emma is asleep." "She is in her crib," I said. "Jess, listen to me. Do not confront him tonight if he comes back. Do not." She said, "Somebody called the house. A woman. She said she was from the district attorney's office, and she asked if I was Scott Ashford's spouse. She said she was leaving a card. She said Scott would want to call his attorney before he called her back." I said, "That was Sherry Delaney. She is standing in the kitchen behind me." Jessica was quiet. Then she said, "Dad, what did you do tonight?" I said, "I did what I should have done at 7:12 in the morning if I had not been on a gurney." She said, "Vogel is Scott's godfather." I said, "I just found out an hour ago." She said, "I have known that since our engagement dinner." The line went quiet for a long time. She said, "I did not think it mattered. Scott said Dennis was a man who had helped his family after his father died. He said it the way people say a coach helped them." "Dad." "I thought it was gratitude," I said. "Jess." She said, "At our engagement dinner, Dennis stood up and toasted us, and he said the 2 of them would build something together." "I thought he meant a life," I said. "He meant a corridor." She started to cry. She said, "I signed things, Dad. I signed the compliance firm as a co-owner in 2023 because Scott said it was for tax reasons. My name is on Ash Corp Compliance. My name is on the shell that was hired to write your report. I closed my eyes, and I felt the tape pull against my eyelid. I said, Jessica. She said, I did not know. I did not know what he was using it for. I did not know he was writing reports about you. I said, I believe you. She said, I am going to be looked at, aren't I? I said, yes. She said, are you going to help me? I said, yes. She said, Dad. She said, I am putting Emma in the car. I told her not to drive. I told her twice. She said, the garage door just opened. I hear the truck. I said, Jess, go out the front. Take the diaper bag. Take Emma. Drive to my house. Do not stop at a light next to another car. Do you hear me? She said, I hear you. I heard the small sound of her lifting the baby out of the crib. I heard Emma make one soft noise. I heard the front door. I heard the deadbolt she had installed herself after a break-in on their street last spring. I heard her breathing. Then I heard the engine start on the other line, and the phone clicked into the dashboard cradle, and she said, quietly, Dad, he saw me. He is at the garage door. He is not coming out. He is just standing there. I said, drive. She drove. Sherry was already on her own phone in the kitchen behind me, calm, quiet, saying a badge number I did not catch. Ruth Halvorsen stood in her doorway with the Christmas card still in her hand. It was 11:20 at night. My daughter was on the interstate with her 7-month-old in the back seat. And somewhere behind her, in the driveway she had just left, my son-in-law was standing very still. Her headlights swung across the emptied carriage house at 11:40 and stopped where the dumpsters had stood that morning. The baby was asleep in the car seat, one small fist under his chin. Jessica did not get out right away. She sat with both hands on the wheel and her forehead against them, and I watched her from the porch with the class. A jacket still buttoned to the throat because I had not trusted myself to take it off yet. When she finally opened the door, she left the engine running. She walked to me with her arms crossed over her chest, as if the cold were the reason. I did not know about Ruth, she said. I did not know about any of them. I did not answer. She looked past me at the dark square where the studio had been, and her mouth did the thing Helen's mouth used to do when she was trying not to cry in front of the grandchildren. Dad. Her voice split on the word. The loan paperwork. I signed it too. That was the sentence I had been waiting for since 8:04 that morning, and hearing it did not feel like winning anything. It felt like watching a beam I had been shoring up finally give. I brought her inside because the baby was in the car, and it was 38 degrees. She sat at the kitchen table where Helen used to sort the glass scraps by color. She would not look at the coffee I poured her. Scott said it was a personal guarantee, she said. He said it was standard. He said Dennis was doing him a favor by being on the paper so the bank would move faster. I asked her when. She said February. I asked her if she had read it. She said she had read the first page and the signature page. There were 4 addresses on the schedule, she said. I thought they were his job sites. I set the 4 condemnation orders on the table between us in a fan, the way you deal cards. Ruth's, Marion's, Sherry's, mine. She looked at them for a long time without touching them. Then she put her hand flat over her own name on the loan copy I had folded on top, as if covering it could take it back. I am a co-borrower, she whispered. Not a guarantor. A co-borrower. Outside, the baby started to cry through the open car door, small and thin, and she went out to him, and I did not follow, because I did not know yet what I was allowed to say. She brought him in and sat him on her lap, and he quieted the way he always did with his mother. She did not stay long. Before she left, she wrote a phone number on the back of a grocery receipt and slid it across to me. That is the woman at the credit union who processed the file, she said. Her name is Angela. She was uncomfortable the whole time. She asked me twice if I understood what a chord or assemblage was. I told her I did not know what that meant. She wrote it in the file. She stood up. Dad, I am going home tonight because his mother is at the house, and she does not know yet, and I do not want her to hear it from anyone but me. I did not ask her what she was going to do after that. She kissed the baby on the top of his head and looked at me. "You look like him tonight," she said. "In the uniform. You looked like the picture on the mantel." She meant her grandfather, the one who had put me through school. She meant it as an apology and as something else I could not name. Then she was out the door, and the taillights went red across the gravel, and the phone in my hand was warm from her fingers. I called Angela at 9 sharp Monday. She did not sound surprised to hear from me. She said, "I have been waiting for someone to call." She met me on her lunch break in the parking lot of the diner 2 blocks from her office, and she brought a manila folder that she did not put on the table between us until she had looked around twice. "I am not giving this to you," she said. "I am reading it aloud, and you are hearing it." She read 6 names. 4 widows. 1 elderly couple in the middle of a probate. 1 man dying of pancreatic cancer whose wife had signed under duress. All 6 inside Scott's LLC schedule. All 6 with Vogel's counter-signature on the fire condemnation, attached as the trigger event that released the loan tranche. "Trigger event," she said, and looked up at me. "That is what the paper calls it. When a parcel is cleared by municipal action, the next draw releases." I asked her why she was telling me. She said her mother had lost the house in a different state, to a different man, a long time ago. She said she had been waiting. I did not go to the paper. The paper came to me. A woman from the county weekly named Nora Kellner had been at the gala Saturday night. She had watched me hand the envelope to the state marshal, and she had watched Vogel walk out through the side door with his tie undone. She had gone home and pulled every fire code condemnation filed in the county for the last 18 months. There were 19. 4 of them were on the same 3-block corridor. She left a message on my machine that said only, "I would like to bring a list of addresses over and read them to you." She came at 2 the next afternoon with a notebook and no recorder. She read the 19. I confirmed the 4. She wrote nothing down that I said and everything down that I did not have to say. Before she left, she asked me one question. "Chief, if I run this Sunday, are you going to be alive to see it?" I told her I had made it through a roof collapse in '92, and I planned to make it through Sunday. She did not smile. She said, "Some fires do not go out with water." Scott came Wednesday at 5 in the afternoon. He did not bring the dumpsters this time. He brought a bottle of the whiskey Helen used to buy me for Christmas and a manila envelope of his own. He stood on the porch and did not ask to come in. "Bruce," he said. He had never called me Bruce. It had always been Chief since the wedding. "I want to make this right." I looked at the whiskey. I looked at the envelope. I did not take either. Behind me, on the coat tree in the front hall, the class. A jacket was still hanging where I had put it Saturday night. He saw it. His eyes stopped on the shoulder braid the way a man's eyes stop on a wound. He held the envelope out farther. "It's a check," he said. "It covers the studio. It covers Helen's tools. It covers what a court would call replacement value. Plus." I did not raise my hand. "That is not a gift," I said. "That is evidence." His arm stayed out for another second, and then it came down. He did not know yet that Nora had the 19 addresses. He did not know yet that Angela had walked her file down the hall to her compliance officer at 4:15 that afternoon. He did not know yet that the state fire marshal's investigator had already been to Marion Halloran's house that morning and to Ruth Halvorsen's house before lunch. He did not know yet that Sherry Delaney had produced from a shoebox in her hall closet the original of a text message Vogel had sent her the night before her condemnation that said, "I can push this to Monday if you need the weekend." He stood on my porch with the whiskey in one hand and the check in the other, and he thought this was still a negotiation. "Jessica is not answering my calls," he said. I told him I knew. He asked if she was here. I told him she was not. He asked where she was. I told him that was not a question he got to ask me anymore. He set the whiskey on the porch rail and left the check beside it and walked back to his truck slowly, the way a man walks who has just realized the ground is not where he left it. I did not touch the bottle for a long time. I sat on the top step in the cold with the porch light off and watched the last light go out of the sky over the empty carriage house. The check lay on the rail beside the whiskey and moved a little every time the wind moved. 6 figures, made out to me personally, dated that day. I thought about Helen. I thought about what she would have said if she had walked out onto this porch and seen a bottle and a check laid out like a bribe on a hymnal. She would not have said anything. She would have picked the bottle up by the neck and set it inside the trash can at the bottom of the steps without breaking stride, and she would have folded the check into quarters and put it in the pocket of her cardigan to give to the widows on the list. So that is what I did with the bottle. The check I put on the kitchen table under the 4 condemnation orders and did not touch again until morning, when the phone rang and it was the state marshal's investigator asking if I could come in at 10. The interview room had a window onto a parking lot and a table with 2 chairs on my side and one on his. He was a man about 50 named Halvorsen. No relation to Marion, he said before I asked. He had my envelope from Saturday night open on the table and Nora's list beside it, and a laptop I could not see. He said, "Chief, I am not going to waste your time. We opened a criminal file at 8 this morning. The fire marshal you trained is going to be arrested by end of day tomorrow. The bank has already frozen the LLC draw account. Your son-in-law is going to be indicted by the grand jury this session. My question for you is not about the paper. It is about your daughter." He waited. He had a face that had listened to a lot of people not answer questions. I told him what Jessica had told me. I told him about Angela. I told him where the loan file was. I told him she had not known about the widows, and I said the sentence twice because I meant it, and because saying it once did not seem like enough. He nodded and typed nothing. Then he said, "That may keep her out of the indictment. It will not keep her out of the paper." Nora ran it Sunday, above the fold, 4 columns wide, with a photograph of the 3 widows and me on Marion Halloran's front steps that she had taken on Friday afternoon in the last hour of light. The headline was 1 line, and it did not use Vogel's name. It said, "The Corridor." The story used everything. It named Scott's LLC. It named the credit union. It printed the trigger event clause verbatim in a pulled quote. It named the 6 parcels. It named the fire marshal by title and by name and by year of appointment. It did not name Jessica. Nora had told me she would not, if the file did not force her to, and the file had not. Halloran's arrest was in the 2nd paragraph. Scott's indictment was in the 4th. In the 9th paragraph, near the bottom of the jump on page 11, there was a single sentence that said, "The department's founding chief, Bruce Kendrick, 66, declined to comment for this article." I had told her the widows were the story. I had told her Helen was the story. I had told her I was only the man who had opened a door. Ruth Halvorsen called me at 7 that Sunday morning before the paper had even landed on the porches. She had gotten a copy at the printer through her nephew who worked there. She was crying, and she was laughing, and she was making the sound old women make when they have been carrying something alone for too long, and someone else has picked up an edge of it. "They gave me back my kitchen," she said. She meant the injunction the marshal had filed Friday afternoon that stayed the sale of her lot. "They cannot put it back the way it was, but they gave me back my kitchen." I told her I was glad. She said, "Bruce, Helen would have brought me a casserole today." Her voice broke on the word casserole. "I am going to bring you one instead," she said. "Do not argue with me." She hung up before I could. She came at noon with a chicken and rice thing and a Pyrex and a jar of green beans she had put up in September and a card with her handwriting on the front that said only, "Thank you," for the door. I sat with her at the kitchen table for an hour, and we did not talk about the paper or the marshal or Scott or Vogel. We talked about her grandchildren and about a wedding at the chapel in June. The chapel called Monday. It was the associate pastor, a woman I had met exactly once, at Helen's funeral, when she had read the 23rd Psalm. She said, Mr. Kendrick, I have something of your wife's here that I think you may not know about. She said a volunteer named Diane had read Nora's article and had come in that morning and had reminded her that Helen had delivered a panel 2 weeks before she died. It was a small window, about 18 inches square, meant for a side alcove that had never been finished. It had been sitting wrapped in brown paper in the sacristy closet for 6 years because the alcove renovation had been postponed and then forgotten. We would like to give it back to you, she said. Diane says you have a south window that is empty. I told her I would come Wednesday. I hung up the phone and sat in the kitchen and did not move for a long time. 6 years the panel had been in that closet. 6 years I had walked past that chapel on my way to the hardware store and had not known. Helen had made the window. Helen had made sure it was somewhere it could not be thrown away. Wednesday afternoon, I drove to the chapel with a blanket in the back seat, and the associate pastor and Diane met me at the side door. The panel was smaller than I had remembered from Helen's sketches. 16 pieces of glass, a pale gold in the center that Helen had called wheat. At 4 o'clock. 2 ribbons of the deep blue she had made her own by melting a bottle. A friend had brought her from a coast neither of us ever visited. A border of the clear rippled glass she had liked because it made ordinary daylight look like it was thinking about something. Diane had cut the packing tape. The pastor lifted the paper. I put my palm flat. Against the lead came, and it was cool, the way Helen's hand had been cool when I had held it the last morning. I did not cry there. I thanked them. I carried the panel out to the car wrapped in the blanket the way you carry a sleeping child, and I set it in the back seat, and I buckled the seatbelt across it because I did not trust myself to drive the 6 miles home without it moving. I installed it Thursday. The carriage house was empty in a way that had stopped hurting during the day, and it started only hurting at dusk, so I worked in the middle of the afternoon on purpose. I measured twice. I cut the sash to fit. I set the panel in with the same points and the same putty Helen had taught me to use on a spring afternoon in the 2nd year we were married. I did not hurry. When I stepped back, the sun was already low. The light came through the wheat at 4 o'clock and laid a bar of pale gold across the concrete floor, exactly where Helen had said it would, in a sketch she had made in a notebook I had found under the workbench the week after her funeral and had never shown anyone. It stayed there for 11 minutes. I timed it. Then the sun moved, and the bar slid across the floor and up the far wall and thinned and was gone. I stood in the empty carriage house in the almost dark, and I did not feel like I had won anything. I felt like I had been allowed to put one thing back. Jessica came Friday evening. She did not bring the baby this time. She had left him with her mother-in-law, she said, because she asked me to bring him, and I said no, and that is where we are. She stood in the doorway of the carriage house, and she saw the panel before she saw me. She walked to it and put her fingers against the lead, came the way I had done, and she did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Mom made this." I told her when. I told her the pastor's name. I told her about Diane. She said, "I filed on Wednesday." I asked her what she had filed. She said, "For separation." Not divorce. Not yet. I do not know yet. She turned around, and her face was not the face of a woman who had made a decision. It was the face of a woman who had made the first of several decisions and knew there were more coming. "I am not asking to move in," she said. "I am asking if I can bring the baby on Sundays." I told her Sundays were open. She nodded once, and she left without staying for coffee, and I understood she was not ready yet to sit at Helen's table, and I did not push. The class. A jacket went back in the closet the next morning. I hung it where it had been for 6 years, and I closed the door. Scott took a plea in the spring. Vogel took a longer one. Ruth got her kitchen. Marion moved in with her sister and rented her lot to a community garden. The widows on the corridor now run together on Saturdays. Sherry Delaney testified at the sentencing and asked the judge for restitution and did not ask for anything else. Jessica brings the baby on Sundays. She has not said whether she is going back, and she has not said whether she is not. Some Sundays we sit in the kitchen. Some Sundays she walks with the baby into the carriage house and stands in the bar of light. I do not follow her in when she does that. There are things a daughter needs to say to her mother without her father in the room, even when her mother is only the color of a piece of glass on a concrete floor. If this reached something in you tonight, sit with it a while before you scroll. Then send it to the person you know who has been quietly edged out of a family that should have held them closer, and tell them the room can be taken, but the thing made in it cannot.